think that's everything. We had one question. I'm not sure if this is so much your area, but it was around how the information is used by program teams. So, for example, to design livelihoods activities or other program like that.
Very much. Very much. I mean, we like to say at registration that, you know, everything starts with registration, right? Of course, all the data that we collect, especially the population data, that all feeds into all the different processes that UNHCR manages, right? And including very much so programming, right? So when it comes to, you know, managing where, what assistance, what kind of interventions make sense, we always everyone always looks at the population, the demographics. What kind of population, what kind of demographics do we have in that particular area and location? All this information that we have in proGres, there's an extensive reporting aspect that comes down from proGres that is you know, it goes straight to all levels of decision making within UNHCR, very much tied in with protection, with programming, supply, you name it, everybody needs, well, not everybody, of course, but most units are relying on accurate, updated population data, which the registration unit collects and manages through proGres version 4. Absolutely, yeah.
Great.
Very important.
Maybe final question would be on occupation and work experience, and maybe just you know, how reliable that information is.
Yeah. Right. How reliable? That's a good question. Let me say it like this. So we, you know, as UNHCR, we collect information based on primarily the beneficiary's account, right? So especially when it comes to occupation, skills and work sets, we don't really see a very great risk of fraud, you know, in that aspect. I mean, why would someone? I mean, there are scenarios, of course, where we could, but you know, if your question is whether we have a protection colleague who goes out there and verifies in one way or another where this person really knows about, you know, farming or pottery or that doesn't really happen in that case. We take their word for it for the most part, unless otherwise indicated or somehow it turns out later on comes to our attention. You have to imagine that, especially when we're talking about large population groups in large refugee settings, our most immediate and most important focus is first and foremost on the protection needs of the individual. So those are the ones that we spend most of the time verifying, updating, and catering for. Occupations and skills, you know, it is something that plays into programming, livelihoods management, but it's not something that, you know, we have the capacity to, you know, put everyone through a test and verify. We take their word for it for most part, yeah. Okay.
Two more questions, sorry. One is about engagement in livelihoods activities. So, for example, if they are in a certain project or something like that, how often is that registered in proGres? So that was one question by somebody.
That depends on the operation themselves, really. As I mentioned before, proGres provides, you know, a large space for recording information, but it is really up to the operations prerogative to make those decisions. What sort of information do they record and put into proGres? In some cases, that could be the case under livelihood programs. We have a local integration module within proGres which accommodates such information. Whether an operation decides to use that module, that particular module, we always encourage it because it's always best, we found, and we did find throughout the last decade that we have been using, 2 decades almost that we've been using proGres, it's always much better in the long run for operations to have most of their case management, process management data in one place. And with proGres version 4, the modular system and the all integrated database, it even enhances the operations ability to monitor, manage, and report on such cases. So we always urge operations, but there is no, there is no global directive on if you have a livelihood program, you have to register it in proGres. That does remain at the operational level to decide.
Okay, Tamas, and then the final question, it's a perennial question that comes up a lot. How often is proGres data updated?
As often as it is updated. This is a tough question to answer once again, and I know I sound like a broken record, but it is highly dependent on the operational context and the capacity of an operation. What I could say is that we have a standard situation, a standard recommendation, which is normally in a registration process. We have the registration of the new arrivals. This can be done at the household level or at the individual level, depending on, again, the scenario. Furthermore, if it was on a household level, then later on, it's absolutely recommended to transform that into a more detailed individual level registration. And then we have effectively what we call a continuous registration process. This normally means that in most of the country operation, most of the context that we work in refugee context, we have a registration unit which is there, which is available to the refugees to update their information based on the local operating procedures. Now, of course, what do we find on the field? Refugees themselves, they're going to be inclined to update their data if it affects their assistance, right? If there's a newborn baby, if there's a marriage, if there's a change in the household composition that affects their assistance, then they're going to be a lot more motivated to come forth and change their data. So when it comes to that, we can say it's fairly reliable. On the other hand, right? If somebody passes away, reduces the size of the household, negatively affects the assistance, the individuals are going to be less forthcoming to come and paper that down, make sure. Because of that reason, we have kind of a global standard of what we call the verification exercises. Again, this is not always in every operation, but normally our recommendation is that every 2 years we do kind of an individual level check on our populations. Normally we use biometrics to identify and update this database. So a verification exercise is usually the best tool to really take stock, update the information, issue new documentations if necessary, update the household compositions, individual statuses, all of that, because usually verification exercises are mandatory. So that's usually a really good point on where we can say, okay, the whole population has been updated in that one point. Again, it's very contextual. There are quite a lot of operations where, for example, registration belongs to the government, and the government is responsible for the registration, gathering and updating of this data. In those scenarios, we normally provide support, technical support, but it's not up to us, for example, to decide on with what frequency and what rules these data gets updated. That's in a nutshell. I hope that kind of answers.
Thanks, Tamas. Sorry, 2 more questions just came in. I'll just quickly answer them. Maybe you can give really quick answers to these 2. One is around an operation where they're supporting host community members up to 40%, and they need to capture that in a structured manner. So is there a field for this? And then at the same time, I'll ask you the second question, which is around access to proGres database. So, for example, in protection, should the whole unit have access to the database or only selected personnel? So maybe you can just quickly answer those 2.
Right. So for the first one, when it comes to host communities, it is not unheard of that we have host community data inside proGres. It is certainly possible. We have something that we call a not of concern or other of concern in proGres. So they wouldn't be. Remember the legal status part, which I was showing. So not everybody needs to be recorded as a refugee, right? So we have something that says others of concern. This happens quite often, especially when we have, marriages between refugees and host community members. In some other times, as you mentioned in your example, when assistance is being provided. That being said, whenever it comes to non-refugee population being registered in proGres, there are usually quite a lot of legal backgrounds that need to be checked, verified. Is that all right with the host government? Sometimes it's a little bit more tricky from the legal sense and needs to be well funded in order to proceed with that. So the SOPs need to be there. The understanding needs to be there with local authorities that this is happening, but it is possible, and there are examples for that, absolutely. In terms of access rights for protection modules, again, that's usually really up to the operation and how they segregate the access rights. So normally within the protection module, we have child protection, we have SGBV, we have general protection, community protection. All of these normally are segregated. So, a colleague working with SGBV case, or let's say the other way around, a person working in community protection probably will not have access to, apologies, to SGBV case files. And that's right the way it is. So it kind of depends on the level of sensitivity of the certain case management, certain cases, which normally determines the level of access. So normally all protection colleagues will have access to basic protection cases, but then child protection might only be viewed by dedicated child protection colleagues and nobody else. Same with SGBV. Again, this is locally determined, so there is no HQ directive on this. It's normally what happens is when we do a proGres deployment, we have a deployment team that goes down and together jointly with the local operation, they look at the context, they look at the colleagues, they look at the way case management works in an operation, and then jointly decide on how best to segregate the user rights and access rights in an operation. Again, it can be very contextual. Not every operation deals with the same amount of or the same level of protection cases.